In early 2000, NEC executives quietly executed a massive retreat, announcing the complete withdrawal of the Packard Bell brand from the American market. The shock was the sheer scale of the erasure. Just a few years earlier, Packard Bell was the undisputed king of the American living room. It was the #1 home personal computer brand in the country, dominating the retail shelves of Sears, Circuit City, and Walmart. Millions of families had carried these beige towers into their homes, trusting a name that sounded like a legacy radio company to guide them onto the internet. But behind the massive sales numbers, the company was drowning in a catastrophic 20% return rate. The crisis was rarely broken hardware. It was terrified first-time users who could not figure out how to plug in color-coded cables, completely overwhelming the support lines. The paradox is that Packard Bell successfully democratized the future, only to be crushed by the cost of supporting it. But the real story of Packard Bell is not only the story of a discontinued brand, it is the story of how America bought its first computers in the same retail aisles where it bought washing machines, and the brutal math of selling the cheapest possible future. Every week, we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, retail stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a calculated psychological trick inside a Los Angeles office in 1986. The personal computer, a computer designed for one person to use directly, usually at a desk or in a home, did not naturally belong in the American living room. In 1986, it was still primarily viewed as an office machine, a tool for corporate accounting and data entry. If a normal family wanted to buy a computer, they had to participate in an intimidating, specialized ritual. They had to drive to a dedicated computer store, a sterile environment filled with fluorescent lights, anti-static carpets, and commissioned salesmen who spoke in a confusing language of processors and memory. The machines themselves, built by industry giants like IBM or Compaq, were prohibitively expensive. A basic setup could easily cost $2,000 to $3,000, the equivalent of a reliable used car. For most of the country, the family desk held a telephone, a Rolodex, a stack of bills, and perhaps a typewriter. The digital future existed, but it was walled off by exorbitant pricing and technical elitism. In a Los Angeles office, a businessman named Benny Alagam looked at this landscape and saw a massive, untapped market. Alagam was not a Silicon Valley engineer working in a garage. He was an immigrant who had been distributing consumer electronics, and he understood American consumer psychology far better than the hardware architects up in San Jose. He knew that if you wanted to put a computer into a normal American home, it could not feel like a daunting piece of high-tech corporate machinery. It had to feel like an appliance. It had to feel safe, familiar, and accessible. The first step to manufacturing that safety was finding the right disguise. In 1986, Alagam and a group of investors purchased the trademark of a defunct American electronics company called Teledyne Packard Bell. Originally founded in the 1920s, the original Packard Bell had manufactured wooden cabinet radios and early television sets before quietly going out of business. To the average American consumer in the 1980s, however, the name carried an immense, subconscious weight. It sounded like a trustworthy, patriotic hybrid of two massive, established technology empires, Hewlett-Packard and the Bell Telephone Company. It was a brilliant psychological trick. When an American family saw the Packard Bell logo, complete with classic mid-century typography and an illustration of a stern, historic-looking man, they immediately assumed they were looking at a legacy institution that had been building reliable electronics for generations. They did not know the brand was essentially a modern startup, importing standard Asian components and assembling them in a California warehouse. The name projected a century of institutional trust onto a brand new box of plastic and silicon. But a safe name was only half the equation. The true innovation of Packard Bell was where that name appeared. Instead of fighting for space in specialized computer stores, Packard Bell bypassed them entirely. Alajim took his computers to the places where Americans were already comfortable spending money: big box discount retailers and department stores. He secured early deals with Price Club, the massive warehouse chain that would later merge to become Costco, and soon expanded to Sears, Walmart, and Montgomery Ward. This was a seismic shift in how technology was distributed. Force 2, the power of retail distribution, changed the nature of the product. By placing a desktop computer on a shelf next to microwave ovens, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners, Packard Bell completely removed the intimidation factor. A family did not need to talk to a specialized technician. They could simply put a computer in their shopping cart alongside their bulk groceries and winter coats. The hardware inside these beige metal towers was not revolutionary. Packard Bell built standard IBM clones. They used a basic processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions, and a standard hard drive, a storage device that keeps files and software even after the power is off. They ran on DOS, the exact same operating system, the core software that manages the computer and lets other programs run, as their more expensive competitors. But because they sold through massive retail chains, Packard Bell could rely on sheer volume to drive down manufacturing costs. A Packard Bell computer frequently undercut an equivalent IBM or Compaq machine by hundreds of dollars. They sold complete bundles in a single box: the beige tower, the heavy CRT monitor, the mechanical keyboard, and a basic mouse. It was the entire digital future, shrink-wrapped and priced for the middle class. To the technology elite, these machines were uninspiring. The trade press often ignored them, and experienced computer users mocked their cheaper components, proprietary motherboards, and limited upgrade paths. But Packard Bell was not selling to the technology elite. They were selling to the father who wanted his children to learn typing. They were selling to the mother who wanted to track family finances. They were selling to the American household that knew the internet and the digital age were coming, but could not afford a $3,000 ticket to enter. By the late 1980s, the strategy was working flawlessly. The brand had successfully infiltrated the American retail ecosystem. At a time when owning a computer was still a profound novelty for a working-class family, Packard Bell was moving hundreds of thousands of units by treating the PC like a household commodity. They had built an assembly line that stretched from overseas component factories through California assembly plants directly onto the concrete floors of American warehouse clubs. They had solved the problem of price, and they had solved the problem of retail access. But selling a computer in a cardboard box was not the same thing as making it usable. When those families finally got the heavy beige boxes home, dragged them into the living room, and plugged them in, they were met with a blank screen and the blinking, unforgiving text prompt of early command line software. The hardware was physically in the house, but the barrier to entry was still too high for a normal consumer. The brand had found its shelf. Now it had to figure out how to make a terrified American public actually turn the machine on. The first barrier to putting a computer in a normal house was physical. Before a family could even look at a screen, they had to assemble the machine. In the early 1990s, setting up a personal computer meant confronting a terrifying tangle of gray cables, serial ports, and parallel connections. If a user plugged the wrong cable into the wrong port, the machine simply refused to work, or worse, risked a short circuit. Packard Bell solved this with a painfully simple hardware innovation: color-coded connectors. The keyboard cable had a purple plug that matched a purple port on the back of the beige tower. The mouse, a handheld physical device used to point and click on the screen, used a green plug. The heavy monitor cable was blue. It sounds trivial today, but in a 1993 American living room, this was a profound psychological relief. It told the consumer that they did not need an electrical engineering degree to build the future. They just had to match the colors. This was the physical breakthrough that prevented immediate retail returns at stores like Circuit City and Best Buy, where buyers were largely left to figure things out on their own. Packard Bell also redesigned the physical footprint of the machine to fit into a domestic aesthetic. Instead of a massive, utilitarian industrial box, they pushed the pizza box desktop design, a slim, flat case that sat neatly under the monitor. They introduced curved plastic molding. Crucially, they integrated stereo speakers directly onto the sides of the CRT monitor. By attaching the speakers to the screen, the computer looked less like a piece of office equipment and more like a television set. It signaled to the family that this machine was meant to produce sound and entertainment, not just spreadsheets. But the physical assembly was only the prelude to the real terror, the operating system. In the era before Windows 95, most PCs booted into DOS, a text-based operating system where users had to type exact, unforgiving commands onto a black screen to make anything happen. For a family who had just spent $1,000 at Sears, the blinking C prompt was paralyzing. Microsoft had introduced Windows 3.1, a graphical user interface, a visual way to interact with the computer using icons and windows instead of text. But even that was considered too abstract and complex for absolute beginners. Packard Bell's software engineers recognized that to keep the computer in the house, they had to hide the actual computer. Their solution was a proprietary piece of software called Packard Bell Navigator. Navigator did not look like an operating system. It looked like an American house. When the computer booted up, the user was presented with a 3D rendering of a comfortable, cartoonish room. It had a desk, a bookshelf, a stereo system, and a door leading to a digital hallway. If a user wanted to write a document, they did not search the hard drive for an executable file. They simply used the mouse to click on the notebook sitting on the virtual desk. If they wanted to play a CD, they clicked on the virtual stereo. If they wanted to learn about their new system, they clicked on the tutorial books resting on the shelf. Navigator was a digital training wheel. It masked the underlying complexity of the machine behind a cozy, domestic metaphor. Experienced tech reviewers and power users at publications like PC Magazine absolutely hated it. They called the interface bloated, slow, and patronizing. But Packard Bell did not care about power users. They cared about the suburban parents who had just bought the machine at a Walmart in Ohio and needed to feel in control. Navigator provided a safe, enclosed sandbox, ensuring that the family's first digital experience was a welcoming animation, not an impenetrable error message. The third pillar of the breakthrough was content. By 1993 and 1994, the technology industry was obsessed with a new buzzword: multimedia. This meant the computer could process not just text, but audio, video, and rich color graphics. To experience multimedia, a computer needed a CD-ROM drive, a piece of hardware that read data from compact disks, holding hundreds of times more information than a standard floppy disk. For most premium computer brands, a CD-ROM drive and a dedicated sound card were expensive, optional upgrades. Packard Bell made them standard equipment. But hardware alone was useless without software. A family unpacking their Packard Bell machine found themselves holding a massive plastic binder drowning in bundled CDs. The box contained dozens of titles: digital encyclopedias like Grolier or Encarta, educational software like 3D Body Adventure, financial planners, typing tutors, and high-speed racing games like Mega Race. It was an instant digital library in a single cardboard box. The whirring sound of the CD-ROM drive spinning up became the definitive acoustic signature of a mid-90s American childhood. This bundling strategy was a masterstroke of perceived retail value. When a shopper stood in the bright aisles of a CompUSA or a warehouse club, they compared a bare-bones IBM Aptiva against a Packard Bell. The IBM was just a box. The Packard Bell included stereo speakers, a CD-ROM drive, the Navigator interface, and a massive binder of free software, all for $300 less. The choice was obvious. The computer was no longer a specialized workstation. It was a self-contained entertainment and education appliance. By bundling everything together, Packard Bell established a massive moat around the American first-time buyer. They were selling a complete functioning digital ecosystem right out of the box. The family did not have to buy a computer and then figure out what to do with it. The machine came with a pre-packaged purpose. By prioritizing accessibility over raw performance and retail presence over technical prestige, Packard Bell accidentally defined the early 90s home computing aesthetic. The heavy beige plastic, the green and purple cables, the reassuring visual architecture of the Navigator software. These became the physical and auditory textures of America's digital awakening. They had taken the intimidating machinery of Silicon Valley and repackaged it into a friendly, disposable commodity that could be tossed into the back of a station wagon. They had made the computer feel completely safe. And by the mid-1990s, that illusion of safety would make them the undisputed kings of the American living room. By late 1995, the American technology market was undergoing a seismic cultural shift. The catalyst was the release of Windows 95, Microsoft's highly anticipated operating system that finally made navigating with a mouse and graphical icons the universal standard. The launch created an unprecedented fever across the country, turning software aisles into crowded spectacles. Millions of Americans realized they needed a new machine to run this modern future. Waiting for them at the front of almost every major retail store in the country was a Packard Bell. This was the absolute peak of the company's glory. The strategy of treating the personal computer as a household appliance had completely conquered the American retail ecosystem. If a consumer flipped through a Sunday newspaper in 1995, the heavy, glossy advertising circulars for Best Buy, Circuit City, Sears, Office Depot, and Montgomery Ward were dominated by Packard Bell's signature beige towers. They had monopolized the end caps and the palette displays. The brand had successfully positioned itself as the default, affordable gateway to the internet for the American middle class. In an American house where the family desk once held only paper and a telephone, this beige tower decided whether a family was ready for the digital age or left behind. The sheer volume of their retail presence was staggering. Packard Bell was not just participating in the market, they were humiliating the traditional titans of Silicon Valley and corporate America. In 1995, they officially became the #1 home PC manufacturer in the United States. They were aggressively outselling IBM, outmaneuvering Compaq, and dwarfing Apple in the consumer retail space. At their peak, nearly 1 out of every 3 computers sold in an American retail store bore the Packard Bell logo. The company was pushing over 2 million machines a year into homes. On weekends, the parking lots of mall electronics stores were filled with families wrestling massive, heavy cardboard boxes into the trunks of Ford station wagons and Dodge minivans. The brilliance of their scale lay in the complete, out-of-the-box ecosystem. A family wasn't just buying a processor and a hard drive. They were buying an entire digital lifestyle in a single transaction. The computer came preloaded with a dial-up modem, a piece of internal hardware that converted computer data into audio signals to transmit over standard telephone lines. This modem was strategically paired with a stack of promotional installation disks for online services like Prodigy, CompuServe, and most notably, America Online. Because Packard Bell was the cheapest machine on the shelf, they became the physical bridge that allowed millions of Americans to hear the screeching, static hiss of a modem connecting to the internet for the very first time. The physical environment of the home transformed around the device. The glowing glass tube of the heavy CRT monitor became a new focal point of the American evening. Teenagers used the bundled software to write school reports. Parents used the built-in fax capabilities to send documents without leaving the house. And children played multimedia games that spun loudly in the CD-ROM tray. To keep up with this insatiable demand, Packard Bell operated a massive manufacturing facility in Sacramento, California. The plant operated around the clock, taking imported motherboards and disk drives and sealing them inside beige metal cases as fast as the retail chains could sell them. Packard Bell had successfully disguised a complex network of global supply chains and Microsoft software contracts as a friendly, essential household utility. They had built an empire by mastering Force 2, the power of retail distribution and shelf space. They proved that in the mid-1990s, the future did not belong to the company with the most elegant engineering, but to the company with the most accessible price tag and the largest display at Walmart. They had achieved absolute dominance over the American big box store, but that exact strategy, selling millions of cheap, highly complex machines to absolute beginners on razor-thin retail margins, was about to trigger an economic trap they could not escape. By 1996, the company's market share, the percentage of total industry sales controlled by a single brand, reached its absolute zenith. Packard Bell was no longer just a hardware manufacturer. It was an inescapable cultural fixture. In college dorm rooms across the United States, students typed midnight term papers on heavy Packard Bell keyboards. In suburban bedrooms, teenagers used the built-in CD-ROM drives to play Myst or listen to their favorite audio CDs. The brand had successfully embedded itself into the daily routines of millions of Americans who had never previously owned or operated a personal computer. They dominated the physical retail space, fed us with a suffocating, undeniable presence. Walking into a CompUSA or a Fry's Electronics in the mid-1990s meant navigating past towering, monolithic walls of Packard Bell boxes. The company was relentless in its bundling strategy, forging aggressive partnerships to include software that normal users did not even know they needed. They packed the boxes with early versions of financial software, digital encyclopedias, and an endless supply of trial disks for internet service providers. For an entire generation of Americans, the specific mechanical grinding noise of a Packard Bell hard drive booting up was the definitive sound of the digital revolution arriving in their living room. To sustain this massive volume, Packard Bell's manufacturing operations in Sacramento had expanded into a sprawling, hyper-efficient logistics empire. They were moving a staggering number of units, forcing established competitors like Compaq, IBM, and Apple into a brutal, margin-crushing price war. The traditional technology giants, accustomed to selling high-priced machines to corporate IT departments and wealthy early adopters, found themselves bleeding cash trying to compete with Packard Bell on the linoleum floors of Walmart and Sears. But this unprecedented scale concealed a fatal structural flaw. To maintain their position as the absolute cheapest machine on the retail shelf, Packard Bell had to aggressively, sometimes ruthlessly, cut manufacturing costs. They utilized highly integrated proprietary motherboards, the main circuit board that connects all the computer's internal components, that were difficult, if not impossible, to upgrade. They used cheaper power supplies. They sourced lower-tier memory chips and budget displays. The machines were perfectly adequate for a terrified beginner turning on a graphical interface for the very first time, but they were notoriously fragile under sustained use. Experienced computer technicians, independent computer stores, and power users openly despised the brand, warning consumers about their lack of reliability and poor build quality. But in 1995 and 1996, the average American family buying a computer at a warehouse club did not read technical trade magazines. They did not care about motherboard architecture or processor cache limits. They looked at the Sunday newspaper circulars. They saw the heavily discounted price tag. They looked at the included stereo speakers, and they pushed the heavy box into their shopping cart. Packard Bell had achieved a miraculous victory. They had bypassed the traditional technology gatekeepers, conquered the American big box retail ecosystem, and successfully placed a personal computer in millions of homes that otherwise could not have afforded one. They were the undisputed champions of Force 2, the power of retail distribution and shelf access. They had successfully put the future in a cardboard box, but as millions of those fragile beige towers began to power on in living rooms across the country, the company was about to learn a devastating lesson. Selling the future was highly profitable, but keeping it running was impossible. The collapse of the Packard Bell empire did not begin with a catastrophic bankruptcy filing or a dramatic technological failure. It began with a small, quiet crack in the American retail system, the liberal return policy. In the mid-1990s, big-box electronics retailers like Best Buy, Circuit City, and CompUSA offered generous, no-questions-asked return windows. This was a deliberate strategy designed to encourage hesitant families to buy expensive, unfamiliar technology without fear. For Packard Bell, however, this retail safety net became a fatal structural vulnerability. As millions of beige towers flooded into American living rooms, a staggering number of them started coming right back. At its peak, Packard Bell's return rate hovered near a catastrophic 20%. 1 out of every 5 computers sold was eventually boxed back up, placed in the trunk of a car, and pushed across a retail customer service counter. The paradox was that the vast majority of these machines were not physically broken. When Packard Bell engineers tested the returned inventory arriving back at the Sacramento plant, they found that an enormous percentage of the computers had absolutely no hardware faults. The problem was the user. The company had successfully sold highly complex machinery to absolute beginners, people who had never used a mouse, navigated a graphical interface, or installed a driver, the essential software that tells a computer how to communicate with a physical hardware device. When an American family encountered a confusing Windows error message, a frozen screen, or a printer that refused to connect, they did not have the technical vocabulary to fix it. They panicked. They called the 1-800 support number, waiting on hold for hours, listening to static, and hold music in their living rooms while staring at a dark monitor. If the overwhelmed customer support representative could not walk them through a fix, the family assumed the machine was a defective lemon and returned it to the store. At the CompUSA return desk, retail workers grew exhausted processing the returns of perfectly functional machines simply because a user had accidentally deleted a necessary file. This created an unbearable financial pressure. Force 1. Hardware, software, supply chains and manufacturing costs began to crush the company. Packard Bell operated on razor-thin profit margins, often making less than $50 of actual profit on a $1,000 machine. If a confused customer called the support line, the hourly cost of staffing that single phone call could instantly wipe out the entire profit of the sale. If the computer was returned to the store, the math became fatal. Packard Bell was forced to absorb the loss, taking back an open-box item that could no longer be sold at full retail price. The physical reality of the Sacramento plant became a logistical nightmare, with loading docks overflowing with cardboard boxes shipped backward from the retail front lines. To survive this massive hemorrhaging of cash, Packard Bell made a fateful logistical decision that would permanently fracture their relationship with the American public. In a desperate attempt to recoup the losses from no-fault returns, the company began quietly harvesting components from the returned machines. Factory workers in California took working processors, motherboards, and hard drives from returned computers, tested them, and placed them into new beige cases on the assembly line. They then shipped these machines back to the warehouse clubs and department stores, selling them to new families as brand-new products. In the fast-moving, highly secretive world of PC manufacturing, recycling components was not entirely unprecedented, but doing it at this massive scale was a dangerous gamble. In 1995, that gamble spectacularly failed. Compaq, a fierce American PC rival based in Texas, deeply infuriated by Packard Bell's ability to undercut them on price, launched a devastating legal and public relations strike. Compaq sued Packard Bell for false advertising, publicly exposing the practice of using recycled parts in computers labeled and sold as new. The resulting scandal was a public relations nightmare. The story spilled out of technology trade magazines and into mainstream American newspapers. A massive class action lawsuit followed. The brand that had painstakingly built a reputation as a trustworthy, legacy American institution was suddenly painted as a deceitful purveyor of second-hand junk. For the average consumer standing in a Sears electronics aisle, the decision was no longer just about the lowest price. The psychological trick of the Packard Bell name had been broken. If a family was going to spend $1,000 on a machine to connect to the internet, they needed to trust the box. The lawsuits forced Packard Bell to clearly label machines containing recycled parts, which was essentially a retail death sentence. Customers actively avoided the boxes with the warning stickers. The company was bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. In 1996, desperate for cash to sustain their massive manufacturing operations, Packard Bell merged with NEC, a giant Japanese technology conglomerate. NEC injected hundreds of millions of dollars into the struggling American brand, hoping to buy their way into dominance over the United States consumer market. But the infusion of foreign capital could not fix the underlying structural rot. The brand was trapped. They were stuck supporting millions of fragile, low-margin machines in American homes, while their reputation was rapidly deteriorating. And just as they were desperately trying to rebuild consumer trust on the retail shelf, the entire American technology market began to shift underneath their feet. A new force was rising from Texas, and it was about to render the entire big-box retail model completely obsolete. While Packard Bell was fighting a desperate, expensive war to maintain its massive presence in American department stores, a completely different philosophy of selling technology was rising from Austin, Texas. Dell Computer Corporation had pioneered the direct-to-consumer model, and their approach was about to expose the fatal economic flaw in Packard Bell's entire retail empire. Packard Bell's business model relied on building hundreds of thousands of computers based on estimated future demand. They purchased components, assembled the heavy beige towers in their Sacramento plant, loaded them onto trucks, and shipped them to big-box retailers across the country. Those computers then sat in the stockrooms and display aisles of Circuit City, Sears, and Walmart, waiting for an American family to walk in and buy them. In the rapidly evolving technology market of the late 1990s, this massive physical inventory was a ticking time bomb. Silicon components, specifically processors and memory, were advancing at a blistering pace. Intel was releasing faster chips every few months. If a Packard Bell machine sat in a CompUSA warehouse for 90 days, the technology inside it became outdated, and the retail price had to be slashed. Packard Bell was absorbing the cost of shipping, the cost of warehousing, the retailer's profit margin, and the devastating depreciation of aging hardware. Dell bypassed this entire physical infrastructure. They did not sell computers in stores. If an American consumer wanted a Dell, they called a 1-800 number or went onto the early internet to place an order. Only after the payment was processed did Dell actually build the machine. They held almost zero inventory. They did not pay a middleman, and they never had to discount a computer because it had been sitting on a shelf for 3 months. Because of this extreme efficiency, Dell could offer a significantly faster, higher quality machine for the same price that Packard Bell was charging for aging, lower-tier hardware at the mall. This shift in distribution exposed another critical vulnerability: the maturation of the American consumer. Packard Bell had built its empire by selling to the terrified first-time buyer. The color-coded cables, the Navigator software, and the bundled encyclopedias were perfect for a family that had never touched a mouse. But by 1997, millions of those families had spent a few years using their machines. They had grown comfortable with Windows. They understood how to connect to the internet. They were no longer terrified beginners. When these families were ready to buy their second computer, they did not want a patronizing 3D interface or a box full of trial software. They wanted more memory, faster processors, and the ability to upgrade their machines. This is where Packard Bell's cost-cutting manufacturing decisions became a trap. To keep prices low, the company had heavily utilized proprietary motherboards, custom-designed main circuit boards that deliberately restricted the ability to add new hardware. If a user wanted to upgrade their video card to play a new game, they often found that the Packard Bell case simply would not accommodate standard aftermarket parts. The machine was a closed box, designed to be replaced rather than improved. The American public realized they had outgrown the brand. The same families that had proudly carried a Packard Bell out of Walmart 3 years earlier were now picking up the phone to order a custom-built machine directly from Dell or Gateway 2000. As consumer demand softened, the retail chains that had once been Packard Bell's greatest strength began to turn against them. The big box stores were exhausted by the brand. The catastrophic return rates were clogging their customer service desks, and the profit margins on the cheap machines were too low to justify the massive amount of floor space they required. In 1997, the unthinkable happened. Best Buy, one of the largest electronics retailers in the United States, officially announced it was dropping Packard Bell from its stores entirely. Losing Best Buy was a devastating blow to Force 2, the power of retail access. When a brand relies entirely on physical store shelves to survive, losing the largest shelf in the country is a death sentence. Other retailers quietly began shrinking their Packard Bell displays, replacing the beige towers with sleeker machines from HP, Compaq, or even Sony. The sprawling, neon-lit aisles that had once been absolute monopolies for the brand were suddenly hostile territory. NEC, the Japanese parent company, watched their American investment turn into a financial sinkhole. They had poured over $1 billion into Packard Bell, hoping to maintain dominance over the United States consumer market. Instead, they found themselves funding a sprawling, inefficient California manufacturing plant that was losing money on almost every machine it shipped. The brand's reputation was irreparably damaged by the recycled parts lawsuits. Their retail partners were abandoning them, and the direct sales competitors were systematically dismantling their market share. In late 1999, the executives in charge finally accepted the brutal math of the American tech market. NEC announced a massive restructuring. They would fire thousands of employees, shut down the sprawling Sacramento assembly plant, and officially withdraw the Packard Bell brand from the United States completely. The company that had introduced millions of households to the digital age was simply giving up and going home. The strategy failed. The margins collapsed. The stores rebelled. The shelves emptied. The assembly lines stopped. The brand retreated. The empire was gone. But the physical legacy they left behind in millions of American homes was just beginning to gather dust. In the United States, the Packard Bell name effectively vanished in the year 2000, evaporating from the Sunday newspaper circulars and big box retail shelves as quickly as it had arrived. But the brand itself did not immediately die. NEC, the Japanese parent company, simply retreated across the Atlantic. For the next decade, Packard Bell continued to operate in European and African markets, completely severed from its American roots. By 2008, the brand was acquired by Acer, a Taiwanese computer manufacturer, which officially reduced the once mighty American retail giant to a secondary budget label for overseas consumers. The legacy radio name that Benny Alagam had purchased to project American institutional trust had become a hollow corporate trademark, passed between multinational conglomerates until it lost all its original cultural weight. Yet back in America, the physical footprint of their 1990s dominance was too massive to simply disappear. Millions of those heavy beige metal towers ended up pushed into attics, shoved into basements, sold for pennies at estate sales, and eventually dumped into e-waste recycling bins. For years, they were considered the ultimate junk hardware, the punchline of early internet forums, and the bane of thrift store electronics shelves. But today, a quiet shift has occurred. A vibrant American preservation community, vintage computer collectors, retro gaming enthusiasts, and technology historians, has begun rescuing these machines from obscurity. On platforms like YouTube, hardware restoration channels painstakingly clean the yellowed plastic, rebuild the proprietary power supplies, and carefully reinstall Windows 95. They actively hunt down the original color-coded cables. They scan and archive the heavy software CD binders, specifically preserving the digital architecture of Packard Bell Navigator. To boot up Navigator today is to walk through a digital museum of an internet that no longer exists. A time when an operating system had to pretend to be a physical house, complete with a virtual living room and stereo, just to make terrified users feel safe. They rebuild these machines not because the hardware was brilliant, but because it is the only authentic way to experience the exact mechanical sensation of the mid-90s multimedia boom. This is not mere nostalgia. A restored Packard Bell desktop, complete with the physical, clicking mechanical keyboard, the purple and green plugs, and the curved plastic speakers bolted to the sides of a heavy CRT monitor, is a physical argument about how the personal computer became a normal household item. Before Packard Bell, the PC was a sterile, intimidating office tool. By bundling everything into a single, affordable, color-coded box, they forced the machine out of the enterprise sector and into the family room. They absorbed the friction of the digital transition for the American middle class. The physical infrastructure that supported this empire has been completely erased. The massive Sacramento manufacturing plant that once pumped out millions of these beige boxes, running 24 hours a day, was eventually shuttered, sold off, and repurposed, erasing the physical epicenter of the company. The sprawling, neon-lit aisles of Circuit City and CompUSA, where these machines were once stacked to the ceiling, have themselves collapsed, victims of the very online shopping revolution that these early computers helped create. There is a profound, surprising footnote to the Packard Bell story. At the height of their dominance, Silicon Valley elites and professional reviewers fiercely criticized the company for building closed, rigid systems. They mocked the proprietary motherboards, the deliberate inability to easily upgrade internal components, and the underlying philosophy of treating a computer like a disposable television set. But history proved that Packard Bell's core assumption about the American consumer was entirely correct. They understood that normal people did not want to be systems engineers. A few years later, Apple would introduce the iMac, and later the iPad and iPhone, beautifully designed, completely closed hardware ecosystems that could not be upgraded by the user. The entire modern technology industry eventually adopted the exact philosophy that Packard Bell was relentlessly mocked for, turning complex, open computing into simple, disposable, sealed consumer appliances. America did not stop wanting the future. It simply stopped buying it in a massive cardboard box at a warehouse club. The broadband internet connection eventually replaced the screaming dial-up modem. The smartphone absorbed the educational CD-ROMs. The digital app store completely replaced the Navigator interface. The physical retail shelf was conquered by the convenience of online direct sales. But the digital fluency that modern Americans take for granted had to start somewhere. It started in those heavy, frustrating, affordable boxes. Somewhere in the back of an American thrift store, a yellowing Packard Bell desktop still sits with its color-coded ports exposed, a silent beige monument to the days when the internet was something a family bought in a box at Sears. See you in the next one.